Okay, so bacteria is just one example of genetically modified organisms, okay, that we can use. We can also genetically modify plants. Okay, and we can genetically modify plants to produce a bigger yield, okay, for example, a bigger crop yield. We can also genetically modify plants to be resistant, okay, to things like disease, possibly even frost, okay. So in plants, we can really use genetic modification for a number of things, okay. Whereas in bacteria, it can also be used for other things, obviously, but the insulin is the example that you will probably come across. So with this section of work, again, what you have to be able to do is you have to be able to give arguments for genetic engineering or genetic modification, okay, but you also have to be able to give arguments against genetic modification. You have to read very carefully in tests and exams as to which arguments they're going to be asking for. And sometimes it could be asked as an integrated question where they say, for example, give 3 arguments for and maybe 2 arguments against genetic modification. Okay, and for that reason, you have to be able to give both. So let's look at arguments for genetic modification. Okay, number 1, which is linked to the insulin, it allows us to produce medicines. Okay, and a specific example we know, although insulin is a hormone, okay, it's classified as medicine, especially for diabetics, okay. Genetic modification and genetic engineering is going to allow us to produce medicines, which we've said is life-saving. Not only does it allow us to produce medicines, but it can also allow us to produce medicines cheaply. Okay, so again, as long as you have bacteria, the Escherichia coli is the strain of bacteria that does this, okay, that we can use in making insulin. It is a fairly inexpensive thing to be doing ultimately to produce high amounts of insulin. So you're producing medicine and you are producing them cheaply, which is really a win-win situation. Then the other thing we said, crop yield can be increased, okay, in plants. Okay, so here you can have a higher yield of crops. This is good for people who are the farmers. Okay, it's going to put money in their pockets, but it's also for the consumer going to allow you to have accessibility to foods. Okay, the more the farmer can produce, the more the people in the country kind of have access to it. And then another thing we can do is we can prolong the shelf life, okay, of fresh produce can be lengthened, okay, or increased. You could really use either there. Okay, so the shelf life is basically how long fruit and veggies are, viable for in a shop or in a store. If you are able to use genetic engineering, which is going to increase the shelf life of certain fruit and veggies, it makes it a much better buy, okay, because work that technically you have done already, food wastage, okay, remember it was the grade 11 work, and you were supposed to cover this again in your first term's work, okay. Food wastage is a massive problem. We waste 1/3 of the food in our country, and a lot of times we do that because we buy possibly what we don't need immediately. It maybe lies in a drawer or it lies in the fridge, but ultimately it rots and it goes off and we end up throwing it away. So if we are able to lengthen the shelf life, it's going to reduce food wastage, okay, and it's also possibly going to allow people who don't have facilities like fridges to have better access to fresh fruit and veggies, okay, because the shelf life has been lengthened. So those 4 are just, 4 of the arguments that you can use in support of genetic engineering. And then obviously the flip side of this coin is that there are arguments against, okay, genetic engineering. The first thing is that the initial cost is very high. Okay, so that means that the initial cost is very expensive. Okay, so it sounds almost contradictory. Okay, we've just said over here that as an argument for genetic engineering, that it's actually quite a cheap way in which to make medicine. Okay, one of the things you could use as an argument against, okay, is that the initial cost is very high. Okay, but once that has been done, then it can actually be used as an argument for genetic modification. Okay, but facts are facts. The initial cost of setting up a lab, making sure that you have people to test these facilities and run through the process and make the genetic modification happen, that is a very expensive thing to do in the beginning. Some people would argue that we are interfering, okay, with nature, or ultimately even a higher being, God. Okay, so that could be something that you could use as an argument against genetic modification and genetic engineering. Some people will say that it doesn't really matter what the issue is. Nature has possibly intended something to be this way, or nature or God, okay, separately have not intended for something to be a certain way. So then people would argue against genetic engineering and that we should kind of leave alone things that have, happened and try and not interfere too much. There are potential health implications, okay, associated with genetic modification and genetically modified foods. Okay, so what you have, for example, let's just say you have a tomato. Okay, tomatoes have health benefits. They're high in vitamin C, there are antioxidants, and there are other things in them. But tomatoes are some of those foods that can rot really easily, okay? Especially in summer when it's really hot, then hormones in the plants, cause them to ripen a little bit more quickly, and, there's increased temperature and things like that. So what we can do, just as an example, is you can remove a fish enzyme, okay? And you can actually insert it into the tomato, which will be a benefit in the one sense that you can possibly improve the shelf life of this tomato, okay? But now what we have is a potential health implication, because if there are people who are allergic to fish enzymes, now suddenly it's going to seem as if they are allergic to tomatoes as well, okay? And that is a potential health risk. So any foods that are genetically modified, okay, GMO foods or GMO goods, you have got to mark it on the packaging, and you've got to say, this tomato contains a fish enzyme and it is a GM food, it has been genetically modified, and then people actually have a choice, and not only a choice, they can actually make an informed choice as to whether or not they are going to eat that tomato. So if they know that they have fish allergies and that a fish enzyme has been used, people have to be told, okay, about that, so that they can choose not to eat the food, because otherwise we face possible health implications. Okay, this is linked to the fact that a lot of research, okay, still has to go into genetic modification. Okay, we still have a lot of research that has to happen, and linked to research, okay, is that so far we are unsure of the long-term effects of GMOs. Okay, so it links, possibly to the potential health implications, okay, that we've looked at already. So those four things: the initial cost is very high, we are interfering with nature and God, we are exposing people to potential health implications, and at this stage we are unsure of the long-term effects of GMOs. These are all things that can be used as arguments against. So again, you have to know the arguments for, you have to know the arguments against, and just read very carefully in your tests and exams as to which they are looking for. Okay, if they are looking only for arguments for, then you'll cite these. If they are looking for only arguments against, you will use these. But sometimes they might ask you to cite 2 or 3 from each. Okay, so you will have to know both.